introduction. I'm Jennifer Lyles. I'm a public historian, and for the last few years, I've been working with the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. And through that project, I'm part of the Baltimore County Coalition. And I was able to work with several other historians and community members. And through that work, I've been working with Nancy Goldring, who is the head of their Improvement Association. And with the work that I have been doing with her, we decided to kind of get together and do this work together in sharing the history of East Towson. And so we probably have some more projects to come if I can make that happen, I hope. But I had come to Trinity to ask them what their history was within the Black community, mainly because I was studying the lynching in 1885, and I wanted to know if there was any records that had mentioned that. I was not able to find any of those, but what I was able to find was that as far back as 1860, 1865, that Trinity was servicing some members of the Black community. And I found this through the registries that are down in the archives. And so what I'm going to go over today are the archives that have shown baptisms of the African-American community that surrounded Towson at the time. So I put up here a brief history of Trinity, which I think a lot of people have seen this history. This comes from Kingsley Smith and others who put the history together for Trinity over the milestone years. But the biggest part of this is showing that this is truly, Trinity is truly in the middle of downtown Towson and has been so since 1860. It existed prior to that in the way of Epsom Chapel, which is owned, the property now is owned by Goucher and is no longer there. But Trinity has a very rich history within its community, but also the people of Towson. And so I hope to show how all of that has combined into a rich history of both East West Towson, downtown, and actually Baltimore County. So again, this is part of the history, but the founders are John and Eliza Ridgely of Hampton, James Howard, who was also married into the Ridgely family, and his son, Reverend Charles Ridgely Howard, Robert Taylor, Mr. Urath Stevenson, Mrs. Henry Turnbull, Mrs. Mary Sheely, and Reverend John Francis Hoff, which is the first rector of Trinity. Here is a map of Towson from 1877. What I did was I highlighted everybody who was a part of the Trinity Register. So all the people in yellow were all homeowners and actually a part of the Trinity Church. And if you can see, here's Trinity right here. I'm circling it. And we are 2 blocks away from the courthouse, which becomes a bigger deal as we continue to make Towson the county seat of Baltimore County. But as you see the Civil War ending, so post 1865, we're going to see a lot of laws and policy put into place, and a lot of the players were Trinity members. And so Trinity was really a powerhouse, a gathering powerhouse of the powerful of Towson and Baltimore County, and also those who not only made laws, but defended laws, a lot of lawyers, a lot of real estate owners. So this will come into play. Here are the family names from the registry, 1860 to 1882. And I'll be talking about not a lot of these because that's impossible, we only have an hour, but I'll be talking about some of these next week. And you know, how their family shaped Towson to today. You'll see some of the names, Bosley, Stevenson. These are all roads that are around Towson, and it's because of the property and the housing that was there named after them. And then Ridgely, of course, is a name that we all know. I'm not a Ridgely scholar. I've learned a lot about Ridgely over the years, only because of approximation of Hampton to the work that I've been doing. But I've learned enough to give you a little bit of an overview as how that approaches what the work I'm doing today. So this is saying the same thing. The one thing we were surprised by was finding African American names in the registry, because that's not what we assumed when I was talking to Reverend Wiley to begin with. We knew that there were Black families who had come into the church, were even taught by the Keaches, and there was a Sunday school prior to the Black churches being established in Towson, but I didn't expect to see the names in the registry. And so that was a pleasant surprise, because that's allowed me to do the work that I'm doing. So these are the baptisms that were listed. Again, this is the years from 1860 to 1885, but we actually went back down, my daughter and I, and looked until 1910. And so we were able to capture a few more. I was able to research most of them, but not find a tremendous amount of information, or for some, not any information at all. But the one thing to note, especially the first names that we see here, these are all names of people who were once enslaved by the Ridgeleys. And so what we do know is that there was a deep relationship between Trinity and Ridgeleys. Not only were they founders, but if you go to the Hampton plantation now, what you will find is a plaque outside of the graveyard that shows a depiction of Reverend Hoff doing a funeral at the house there, and he's mentioned. So what I've come to understand is that the Ridgeleys were extremely devout religious people and wanted to bring that religion to their plantation, and they would often host weddings, usually during the Christmas season, because that's kind of the off season for harvesting and for the work that was done there for their enslaved peoples. So it's not a shock that you're then going to see some of these same names that we find in the registry at Hampton. And Hampton has amazing records, and they have a plethora of documents that name the enslaved peoples, bills of sale and manumissions. It's a lot of records that have actually been utilized recently to do a survey, and then that survey's been released into a report within the last 2 years that really does break down this work. If you want to know more about it, I would check that out. So what we're going to find first is Nancy Rebecca Posey. She was baptized in Trinity, though she was the first African-American to be baptized on August 10th, 1865. And her parents were Mark Posey, who was the head waiter, and Louisa, and her maiden name was Humphreys, both of which were enslaved by the Ridgeleys. Louisa was Mark's second wife, and both were enslaved by them at Hampton, and when they were married in 1860. They had Edward in 1861, Mary J in 1863, and Nancy in 1865. And Louisa's parents, Nancy's grandparents, were Edward, who was purchased in 1841 from the estate of James L. Hawkins of Frederick County and Baltimore, and Peggy Humphreys, who was also enslaved at Hampton. So we have multiple generations. In 1870, post the Civil War, we find Mark Posey. He's a hotel waiter at the age of 56, living in Towson Town. Louisa, his wife, and then their children, including Nancy. We also find the Howard family living there with them, as well as the Humphrey family, so multi-generational. Their son, Mark John Posey, was baptized at Trinity on January 29th of 1871, but no other records exist from him. So that's saying that most likely he died young. So that's the first one we have. We have Eliza Jane Brown. According to Hampton's records, her parents may be Ambrose Brown, who was also enslaved in Hampton, and Amanda Wells, who was born in 1835, and she was enslaved into 1864. Ambrose Brown's first wife was Polly Batty, and Batty was a big name that they've been able to track because it's not a common name. One thing about when you're doing research and you have names like Smith or Brown, it's you know, and my mom's maiden name is Joan, so I understand this very well. When it's so common, it's hard unless you have very common first names. And so the Hampton researchers were able to really do a thorough Batty family tree. And the Battys actually went up into PA because when there was a release in 1829, some Battys were actually sent to farms and plantations in Frederick County, so a little closer to PA. Ambrose is the father of the Hampton nanny, Nancy Brown Davis. And that name is pretty known to Hampton because she was a nanny who worked there post enslavement as well. And she's the only Black person buried in the Ridgely family graveyard. And she is buried there near her charges. And they had a great love and affinity for her. So it's not a shock that they put her in the cemetery with them. But one thing to note is that there definitely was at one point another graveyard at Hampton, but unfortunately that graveyard is no longer, and they don't know exactly where it was. And so a lot of these other families who had other family would have been buried in that graveyard, and it could be possibly where 695 is now. It could be under the ground and no one knows, and it could be in other portions. One thing to note is the Ridgeleys had 20,000 acres, so it could have been in any numerous directions. The Ridgeleys went up, you know, to Cockeysville, down to pretty far south, to the east to Middle River, and to the west to Reisterstown. So that land is huge. And then you had Ridgely family that owned beyond that. Eliza appears in Trinity's records again in June of '88 when she married Nicholas Williams in the rectory. They are not found in the census after that, but Nicholas Williams is married to another person by 1900. So possibly Eliza had passed. Her mother in 1870 worked for Nelson Cooper, and the Cooper family actually belonged to Trinity, and they were the overseer at Hampton up until obviously the Civil War, and then continued as the same sort of position, but not over enslaved peoples. And in 1880, she worked for the John T. Enzer family, which is another popular name. So what we have here is, and I'm going to mar you down with names, but you'll start to see these names click constantly because you see them again in the weddings, and then you'll start seeing the same last names, Brown and Batty and Williams. Mary Ellen Brown was born on March 15th, 1874 to Thomas and Caroline Davis Brown, so Davis again. Mary Ellen was baptized by Reverend Hoff on November 13th, 1874. And I want to just recognize the fact that for this time frame for African Americans to know the birth dates and baptism dates is huge. For many people who research this specific type of history, it is not easy to find these dates because it's usually written in family Bibles. This is prior to birth certificates. So being able to have this for a family is a pretty big deal. And especially when you're talking about people who are one generation removed from enslavement, some of their family were actually able to know what their birth dates were. So this is, you know, a treasure trove of information for the family. Her parents were married at Trinity on September 30th in 1865, and her father was the head waiter at Hampton post the Civil War, and her mother was the dairymaid and sister-in-law to Nancy Davis. So the Hampton nanny I was talking about. And I have here, and let's see if it will actually let me go to it, but I'll talk until, okay, it's popping up. And now I will share this screen too. It didn't share it. New share. Okay.
Now click on that new screen. Screen 2.
Thank you, honey. Yeah. Okay, so this is Caroline and Davis, Thomas and Caroline Davis Brown. What I wanted to show you is that, oh, it didn't share. maybe it's that one.
Yeah.
Are you seeing this or no?
No, it's not.
Are you seeing the website?
Yes.
Okay. So this is actually a picture of Thomas Brown in 1897 in the dining room at Hampton, which is still decorated in the same way. So I thought it was really interesting because, again, photos of people of this time, especially people of color, is rare unless the people in which they worked for took photos of them. And a lot of times they were not identifiable. And so this, of course, actually was identified and shared by, this is the website, the National Park Service that owns Hampton now. So I thought that was quite interesting that we were able to see this photo. Okay, so now I gotta go back.
Go to that one,
Mhm.
and then go back to the page you are.
This one,
And
Okay.
New share,
you share.
and then the not the screen two, but the other one all the way on the left.
This
Down
one.
one. No, down one. Because you just shared the.
What did I share?
You shared the wrong one.
Sorry.
You're okay.
Thank you, honey.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
Okay.
getting back right there.
Eliza Jane. Okay, now I'm back where I am. Okay, so Thomas Brown, who I just showed you the photo of, is the first cousin of Nancy Brown Davis, who was the nanny. And like I said, their family has been widely researched and has been able to piece together to back in the early parts of the enslavement at Ridgely. One thing to note is that in 1829, Ridgely, when he passed, he released some of the enslaved, and anyone under 2 and anyone over 45, anyone under 2 were free. 2 until, I think, I can't say the exact ages. Basically people who were in their prime working and also parenting age were kept. And then the elderly were sent to be still enslaved, but then taken care of by other family. And so they were actually sent to different locations. And the problem being is that if you had there's one story of a little girl who was 3, so she missed the cutoff. But you had issues where there were children who were freed, but their parents were still enslaved. Or the other way around, there were parents who were freed, but then there were children who were still enslaved. And so that's why communities like East Towson and Sandy Bottom were so important and sprung up, because the proximity to where the family was still living, because there are generations of that family located there. And in 1841, the Ridgely who takes over realizes that he no longer has the workforce that he needs. So he makes another purchase. And so new families come and new generations of families come over to Hampton and remain there until freedom, which happened in Maryland in the fall of 1864. So it is, again, a difficult history when you're talking about this, because it ebbed and flowed. People came and went. And in some cases, families were split in multiple directions. And so other families found niches like Sandy Bottom and East Towson to be the landline for their families to be able to reconnect with them. And it's one thing that we look back now and say, they had to wait until 1864, but we have to remember they didn't know when they would have to wait or if there would ever be a time. So that's what's important to remember. Thomas Brown was the son of William Brown, who was the coachman of Cowpens. We have a Cowpens Road. So now you can understand where that was located. And that was a Ridgely heir. And then Caroline Davis was the son of Bill Davis. Her and her siblings were all enslaved and worked at Hampton. I have William Henry Meads. William was born on the 5th of May, 1877, baptized on the 14th of April, 1879, and was the son of James and Lucy Berry Meads. Berry is another name that's been very easy for them to research. He was one of 10 children, and his father was a farmhand, and the family lived in Towson. during the Great War, William worked and lived in Baltimore, and he worked as a chauffeur for William Whitridge and lived on Caroline Street. Because of a lot of jobs and skills that people had during the time of enslavement, they were able to switch those same skills over to being paid positions, not highly paid in some circumstances or many circumstances. But you would have in Towson the spring up of middle-class families or upper-class families who needed domestics. And so again, what we're going to find later is you see these same names popping up in Towson as the domestic servants of Towson residents. So again, the living, like Nancy said, she's lived in Towson and grew up there. Her family's been there for 7 generations. So James worked as a coachman and a driver, as well as a farmhand while living in the Towson area, and served in the U.S. Colored Troops 30th Infantry during the Civil War. Lucy, prior to ending of the Civil War, was a free woman living in the household of Dr. Calloway in Cockeysville, and she was 16 and worked as a cook for the family. Galloway, there's a road named after him. Why he is important is that he was the director and doctor at the Almshouse, which is now the Baltimore County Historical Society. And he ran that from a young man all the way up until being an older gentleman. And his family had been landowners in Towson and Cockeysville for generations as well. So that name is pretty well known for the fact that because he ran the almshouse, he provided medical care for the poor and usually African Americans in the Baltimore County region. Both she and James are buried at St. John AME Church graveyard in Ruxton, which is the location of where the lynching victim Howard Cooper was also buried. James William Garfield and Nellie Jones. James William Garfield Jones was baptized on the 1st of February, 1881 by Reverend Hoff, and his parents were John H. and Margaret Jones. And then on 8th of March, 1886, they gave birth to Nellie Jones, and she was baptized in Sandy Bottom by Reverend Powers on 19th of December, 1886. Living in Sandy Bottom, why this is really pertinent is that Sandy Bottom, again, an African American community down the street, allergies, is down the street from Trinity, down the hill, which is now Bosley. But they were living with the Johnsons, who had also been baptized. And they both came to Trinity to have their children baptized there. John Jones worked as a gardener and Margaret worked as a housekeeper. Excuse me. So I put this one on there because another community that had an African American community within it is Lutherville. And that's actually where a colored school was located as well, which is still owned within a family that goes to Trinity, which is Linda Jolly's family. It's the Brown family. They own the school. And they recently opened it up for a tour and a reunion of students because the school itself did not close into the 1950s. Charles Edward was born on the 18th of January, 1886 in Lutherville to Joseph and Amelia Chase Smith. Charles was baptized by Reverend Powers, and the family was living in Baltimore on Webster Alley. And the father, Joseph, was a laborer while Amelia was a cook. In 1910, the family was living in East Towson on Chesapeake, and their father, Joseph, was no longer living, and their mother was working as a washerwoman for a private family. Charles was working as a hostler at a livery stable. Amelia Chase Smith was born free to a family in Baltimore. Her father, William, was a porter, and her mother, Eliza, owned property in Towson in 1880 as a widow with children. Eliza lived with her daughter, Amelia, until her death into her late 80s, early 90s. So again, another connection to East Towson. Amelia Louisa Matthews was born in Sandy Bottom in October of 87 to Benjamin and Margaret Matthews, and was baptized by Reverend Powers in 1888. Benjamin was born in December of 1832 and married her mother, Margaret, in 1870 when she was 20. They had 10 children and lived in Sandy Bottom. So Benjamin was a day laborer, and her siblings took jobs as laundresses, coachmen, domestic servants within the area. Emma then married into the Mack family. The Mack family is well known in East Towson for being homeowners and holding on to their houses for at least 100 years. And actually Nancy Goldring, who was there, lives in one of those houses, in the Mack house. And they were also very active in Mount Olive Church. Emma Mack was a widow and a mother of 2 in 1910 and worked as a laundress and lived with her parents. She had married Charles Mack of East Towson and had 2 sons, Charles and Walter. Walter ended up being the person who worked within and lived at Mount Olive. In 1920, she was still living in Sandy Bottom with her father, who was 80 and working as a day laborer on the state roads. She was a cook and had married in the Pinckney family, which is another East Towson family, and was widowed yet again, and her sons were attending school. In 1930, Emma was living with her son, Walter, and his wife, Sarah Myers, and Myers is another name of East Towson, and their son, Walter Jr., born in 1926. This name is interesting because when I was approaching Hanton about their records to see if any of our records crossed, I had sent what I had found, and they actually said they didn't know this information, but they had been looking for it. So I was very happy to share this with Hanton. That's born in 1908 or 1909. It's been written as both, but I do believe it was 1908. Grace was baptized by Reverend Powers in 1908. Her mother was Edith Cromwell, and she brought her to be baptized, and it was witnessed by Catherine McLean. Her mother at the time of her birth was 24 and working and living in the home of Dr. J. Royston Green. And he was a known white doctor who had a practice in East Towson and would be known to see white and Black patients. And it was on Allegheny Avenue. In 1920, Edith was married to Harry Hill and living in Towson on Church Avenue, and they recently gave birth to a daughter named Catherine. By 1930, Edith passed, and Harry was living with 2 daughters, Catherine and Susanna, and Grace was no longer living with her family. Grace lived until the 9th of December, 1992, and was buried at Pleasant Rest Cemetery in Sandy Bottom, which is a cemetery that you would pass it every day if you didn't know to look for it. It's on the hill, and it's across the street from the county detention center. The one thing was that was actually used to be attached to Mount Olive, and Mount Olive was pushed into the Bosley Road before the extension, and the county came across and asked or told Mount Olive that they needed to move their church. So they moved the rectory to behind the location of the church today, and they built a new church. And so what you see now is not the Mount Olive of old, it's a newer church, but the rectory behind it is actually the original rectory house, and that's under Baltimore County Preservation. So that's the names I have for you. I know it was name heavy and it was detailed data heavy, but I wanted to know if you had any questions. And Mary, it's all you today because
there was where Bosley Avenue comes down, and as you go south, no, I guess as you go in north, heading toward York Road, on the left-hand side, is that where that cemetery is that was connected with Mount Olivet Church?
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, there's no signage out there really. Like, it's not something that's huge that you would know.
Right.
It's just
I think it's still an active cemetery. And I thought I saw
it is.
saw a funeral procession going in there once upon a time.
Yeah, before that, there was no Kenilworth Drive. So what they said is that they could carry their dead from the church to the grave without crossing any streets.
Yeah.
And they still like to do that, but it's a little different now with Kenilworth being such a major thoroughfare there.
Yeah.
but yeah.
Okay. I was just curious as if I had the right place in my head.
Mhm. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so most people are buried there. You'll find people being
Oh.
buried in different cemeteries. There's Goff, which is up in Sparks. I mean, I think if people ended up moving on to different churches, but most people that came from Sandy Bottom and East Towson that stayed are located in Pleasant Rest.
The Black community in Lutherville, it's all off of Bosley Avenue across on the north side of the Beltway. Is that correct?
Right, yeah. So if you go to Lutherville now, and you have Bologna and Seminary,
Yeah,
it's the community that is on the other side of Seminary towards going on 695.
right. It's
Yep.
south side of Seminary. Yeah.
Yep,
Okay.
yeah. And there are still some families there. There's still an active church there, but it's not a community that's been preserved for African Americans. There are not many houses that are actually owned and lived in by African Americans any longer.
Well, what's the African American population of East Towson?
I mean, I don't know the
Roughly
exact
speaking.
number, but that's shrunk tremendously. What Nancy told me is that it is 60% Black and 40% white, I think, or I could have flipped it. There are a lot of properties there that are vacant, still owned by someone, but they don't have any tenants. And then there are a lot of rental properties for Towson students there too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and there's white members and of the community. There's other ethnicities as well. It's a pretty mixed neighborhood. The difference is that it's been shrunk. So not only did BG&E come in and take a portion of the community by Railroad Avenue, but then you also have where it extended out to like Virginia, and then that's gone too. So Cinemark and all of the Virginia Towers, a lot of those were built up in the Ridgely Towers. Most of those were built up and then the houses were taken down.
Yeah.
And Hillen Road was another place, but again, that was easy. It's easier to understand the dismantling of Sandy Bottom when you consider the fact that a majority of that was tenant housing. And it was not owner occupied. So when you have then a county that comes in and says, I will pay a price for this, it's easier to then vacate people out of a house if they're renters and they're not owners. And then the owners are going to get money and they don't live there and they're not vested. And so a lot of them were condemned housing, and then the county came in and it became a York Road business corridor instead. That didn't happen in Towson, East Towson, as easily, and trust me, people have been fighting the development that happens in that community because there's so many owner occupied for generations. You know, there are families who have lived there for, like Nancy's, for 7 generations in various houses and continue to own those homes.
Is there any thought of it being declared a historic district and then won't change, or?
Yeah, well, you know, it has been declared historic in the sense that they've put up signs, and they've done an inventory on it being historic. But the problem was when they've come through to try to designate some of the homes themselves, they've said that too many changes had been made over the years to the homes.
Right.
I mean, as I've
I would
gone
think the
through
whole
it,
district could be, regardless of what the
Right.
changes have been. I would think that the fact that it's been there like for 7 generations should be sufficient cause to have it declared a historic district and keep high rises from going up and BG&E from coming in again and
right. And the new
all
development that they're trying to put in there now. And that's the one thing that we've been working on, is that there's a call to put another development in there next to Harris Hill, right off of Joppa. It's an acre and a half. We are asking Baltimore County to actually purchased that land to make it a park for that area because there's such a lack of green space in downtown Towson now. But they're talking about putting a 40-unit low-income development there.
Yeah, I read something about that. And
Yeah, and so that's a fight that Nancy and her community association is having, because it won't service the community. It's going to be bringing people into the community who then will be outsiders, and won't, because there won't be an integration of, you know, East Towson members as well as new members. It's just like a placement of people instead of a thoughtful process, you
right,
know?
right.
And so, and as Nancy says, there's plenty of homes there that could be utilized for low income if the county and state would look into who has properties that aren't renting, and possibly bringing them up to standards, you know, and using programs such as that, so that there isn't vacant housing and then this new high rise yet again, you know.
Progress, progress. Well,
Right.
One step forward, two steps back.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
I'm looking, you know, the benefit of doing this over again at a computer, because if you had been talking about Sandy Bottom to me, that's a name that's completely foreign, and seeing where it used to be, you know, is interesting. So it is pretty much, does it look like it's at like Bosley
Mhm.
and right, you know, right there by Kenilworth?
Yeah,
and
so
off of York
basically it
Road?
would have been like Kenilworth over to, you know, up to Bosley and up to West,
Mm-hmm.
and then up to Goucher.
Okay.
It was a
Wow.
big square there, and, you know, along York Road and within, you know, the areas as well. And when the thought was that they wanted to extend York Road to a business corridor, that was the idea that the ones on York Road would have to go. And then all the housing that was in further, but it was picked because that's where the actual slave quarters were for Hampton. One set, I mean, again, 20,000 acres, they had multiple places, but that was one set, and it was called Sandy Bottom because of the ground was not conducive to planting. So
Got
it
it.
was a sandy bottom. I
Got
mean,
it.
it was, yeah,
and
exactly.
it's kind of like where the Safeway is now.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so it kind of dipped, you know, and now it's so built up, you wouldn't know. But if you think when you do York Road there, you go down the hill and then you go back up. And so that was an entire community there. But
Mhm.
again, the difference was, and you can see, is that why it was not preserved is that because they were not homeowners, there was no value, you know, for the county to keep that as an envelope of a Black community.
Right.
But there's also, and I'm going to get to this, probably our fourth Sunday. And, you know, like I said, we could do multiple of these and keep going into the future, because Carver School was placed there where it is now, but it was the first Black high school in Baltimore County. Prior to that, Black students would have to go down to the city on their dime. And if you're talking about a kid who lives up in Cockeysville, getting down to Baltimore City to go to school every day using transportation, there's not much of an, you're not giving them an option, really. There's no
Right.
option. And so there was a fight about putting Carver there. People wanted to have Carver placed in Cockeysville, away from the proximity of Towson. But Sandy Bottom won out, and that's where Carver was placed, and worked as a school for Black high school youth until we had integration. And then it was turned into multiple schools, like Towson Town Junior High, I've heard Sandy Bottom Elementary School. I've heard number names of the schools that it was there, until it was taken down about, I guess, like 15 or so years ago, and put up the magnet school.
Well, that's in that building there in East House and there on Maryland Avenue and Bosley, isn't it still there? The building that's still there? It was a,
Do you mean in East Towson? You mean the one that's on Lennox Avenue, that Carver
Yeah.
Center? Yeah, that's still there. That's the community center, and that
Yeah,
was once
right.
the elementary school. Yep.
yeah, right.
Yeah, that was
'Cause
Carver Elementary.
we came to Towson in 1961, and of course, by that time, the schools had been integrated, but that building was certainly still there.
Yeah, and I think it was still acting as probably,
I think it was still as partly as a school.
yeah, I believe so. I don't know when that particularly closed. I do know that, you know, kids started going to Towson and the other schools, which is why the need then for Carver, you know, less than 10
Yeah,
years
yeah.
later was gone. But again, as they're building these schools, it's not, you know, it's easy for us to look back and say, wow, 7 years and then it was done. But like
Mhm.
that, they didn't know that was going to be the case, you know.
Right.
So it did fill a need, obviously, to allow kids to go to school, whereas prior to that, that would have been such an investment for the family to have their kid go down to Frederick Douglass and, you know, which was in East Baltimore, but you're talking about taking,
You're talking about
I
20
guess,
miles.
right, and
Yeah.
on a streetcar, you know,
Right.
so,
Yeah.
you know, leaving it up to transportation to get you there.
Yeah, the streetcars still ran when we first came to town.
Yeah, right down York Road, I think,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well, and for me, it was really interesting hearing some of the names because yes, hearing those echoes and hearing names that I've heard before. There was, I just found out today that someone who has worked at our diocesan center there by the archives just passed away over the weekend, and his name was Larry Mack. And I know that his family was from Baltimore, but I don't know if his family was the Mack family that you're referring to. I'm going to have to get in touch with his brother Slim and find out. But it was just to have this name that's in my heart today for a completely different reason, and then go, wait a second, is that Larry's family?
Mhm.
You know, is
Yeah.
it's amazing how not just in this history you see those names again and again, but how those names are still living amongst us.
Right, and I think that was the important part of this project when I was talking to Reverend Wiley, which is like, if we were talking about a community that had once existed, like out in Long Green, there was once an African-American community that's no longer there.
Right.
You know, there's a church and there's a cemetery and it's still an active church and people travel to get there, but it has not been a community in such a long time that it's a historic community, you know.
Right.
There's no remnants of it. But it's very unique to talk about a community that is still not only around, but thriving today, and one in which people want to keep thriving, and still has the members of the community that began that community before slavery ended. So like, it's just such a unique, it's almost like a case study, you know.
Right.
And so it's so important to recognize these names and how they weaved in, because so often the names we hear are Bosley and Sheely, and you know, it's the names that you see attached to Campbell's, the names you see attached to buildings that you go, oh, I recognize that. Oh, I didn't realize that was named after a person. But you're not going to find, you know, Mack Street. But they survived and lived next door, just, you know, for the same amount of time, you
Right.
know.
And in the same, I mean, that they worked in the same families, so
Yes.
those names come again and again.
Mhm.
That is just, I can't wait to keep hearing more.
Yeah, that's, I'm excited to keep showing the circles. And the one thing that I want to implore when I'm doing this kind of history and I'm talking about it is that there has always been tragedy and there's always been sadness, but there's always been joy as well. And so when I tell about these families, I'm telling their stories as they lived. And so it's a good reminder. And I had this conversation with someone about when the school in Lutherville was opened a couple weeks ago, and there was people concerned about the joyfulness that was written on a flyer. And I said to remember that people who are living at these times recognized what they were not getting. They understood that they were living in times where they could not go into a neighborhood. Someone could come into theirs, but they could not go into the other neighborhood. And they knew that they couldn't go to the same schools. But it didn't stop them from having joy in their lives. They didn't live miserable lives for the sake of the history that they were living. And so I want to make sure that I'm telling a very balanced history and not construing someone else's family as being a sad part of American history story for the sake of telling the Ridgely story.
Mhm.
And I know that that's the case because I know my friend Nancy, and I know her family has had nothing but joy and happiness for their community, you know, while their lives had, obviously when you had talking about enslavement, that's not a positive historical fact, but Nancy's a positive person. So I'm making sure that we balance that history.
Mhm.
And I don't want anybody attending these talks and potentially even being related to some of the families that we talk about when we talk about hard to talk about subjects like Confederacy and policymaking and slavery and what have you, because it's not for us to carry on our shoulders now. You know, it's not our family's legacy to carry on our backs. Do you guys have any other questions or?
No, I've got to get ready, and we eat early here at Edenwald. So
So do I, don't worry about that.
I've got to close up and get ready to go downstairs, but this has been fascinating. And are you going to plan to record the other sessions on Sunday morning? Because I could like to be able to tune into it later, you know, like.
Mhm.
Yes, we did. We recorded this last Sundays, and we hope to continue to do this. So yeah,
Good.
I'm looking now. One of the interesting things is the Ridgeleys, of course, are not. They're not only associated with our church. And I had seen a picture, and I can't find it now, but Memorial Episcopal Church, which was founded as a memorial to the Confederates who died, that they have been really struggling with their history, and that they have made some pretty remarkable discoveries. Their current deacon, Natalie Conway, was enslaved. Her family was enslaved at Hampton, and that they were, and that a member of the kind of far removed Hampton family currently serves and has served on the vestry there. And so having Steve Howard and Natalie Conway working together as someone who's a descendant of the family of the enslavers and the family of the enslaved working together. So they actually just, the picture I was looking for and can't find, removed the plaque in the church, which marks the church as a monument and a memorial to the Confederate soldiers who died. So they've just removed that plaque. So there's a big hole, like concrete hole in the wall right now, as they're moving forward and thinking about how to be in relationship with that history. And as Jennifer, I hope that we're going to be able to hear some more about some of our more troubling history on the weeks going by, and how the white members of our community were engaged with this racial history. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's next week when I speak about some of the families, I'm going to touch base just again to understand as you're driving through Towson, why things are the way they are. You know, it's really is settled upon what policy and who were the policymakers
Right.
and who were the powerhouses, who had the money to buy things and buy land and control what was happening. So,
Well, I can't wait. So thank you again so much.
yeah, of
Okay,
course, thank
all
you.
right.
Okay, I will
Thanks for
stop.
doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can always email me if you have any questions, Mary,
Okay,
too.
okay, thanks.
Okay.
I don't go by Mary.